3, 2, 1. Welcome back to the Reactive Training Systems podcast. This is your producer, Jim Elli, and in this fantastic episode, Mike Tuchscherer and I chat with Jacob Tsypkin, a wonderful CrossFit coach and next-level thinker from Anarchos Training Methods, as well as the one and only Helms from 3D Muscle Journey. We talk about finding meaning within your training. We dig deep into lessons we've learned through our training careers, what coaches can do to help their lifters during this difficult time, and what athletes can do to continue to train while the future remains uncertain. If you enjoy this episode, please consider pressing the follow button on whatever podcasting platform you're currently using, and consider following us on Instagram at Reactive Training Systems Podcast. If you love this episode, please consider sharing it to your stories. We very much appreciate any sharing that you can do, and let your friends know that this podcast exists. Without further ado, let's get right into the podcast. Cool. Yeah, we'll figure it out. We got a guy.
A funk band we are not.
I ain't got rhythm.
Man, I've seen people do that, like since the whole social isolation thing, like bands playing on Zoom or whatever. And I think that must be like musicians kind of blow my mind anyway, because I don't have that talent. But then I think like it's hard enough to have a conversation with people over Zoom, and then to like play music together seems next level.
The cool thing about that is that objectively, they must be out of sync.
Yeah.
Because there's a delay.
Yeah.
Like if you were just to take the sounds with like just a really big, like, you know, like if you're the Superman, you'd be like, that's all out of sync. But for every single individual, because they're playing in tune with the delay, they're on time.
Well, let's see.
That's insane.
That's weird, right?
You know, how nerdy do you want to go, Mr. Helms? Because, you know, depending on how far apart you are, you know, it takes time for sound to travel. So Superman might still hear it out of sync, you know? Just saying.
I doubt I doubt the internet delay would be the same as the actual sound delay.
You know, I'm just saying, like, if this question was on your college entrance exam, would you get in?
I would probably manage to talk about getting quantum entanglement between the instruments.
Yes.
I want a quantum saxophone is what I'm saying.
So
right.
Like if you just write an essay about how there's no solution or something, something along those lines.
If someone plays a saxophone with delay over the internet in the forest and it falls on a mine, did anyone actually play a saxophone in the forest?
I think this is
I
think this is Kant, right? This is Immanuel Kant. I think he wrote about this.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Ask the philosopher. Like, dude, this is a thing, right? No. So, I wanted to get you two specifically together, Jacob and Eric, together to talk about finding meaning in training. And so just to kind of give some background on this a little bit and why I thought this might be a neat conversation. So this started a little while ago, a few days ago, when Jacob and I were talking about training stuff and kind of angled around onto the topic of finding meaning in training and motivations for athletes, you know, and thinking about motivation coming from, in a lot of ways, autonomy, mastery, and purpose. That's an idea that it's probably not like widely known, but it's a lot more widely known than it was, you know, just even a couple years ago. It seems like mastery is something we can wrap our heads around pretty easily in iron sports, like the lifting sports in particular. But purpose is something that seems to be really important, but is a little more nebulous than something like mastery, right? And the more I think about it, the more of a big deal I think it becomes, and I'm sure that we'll kind of come back around to that in a minute. But then this kind of connected to a conversation, Eric, you and I had. Gosh, this was back at one of the EPCs that we did, and we were talking about the same topic, and you were talking about Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. And I've seen you, I know that you, there it is. So, and I've seen you talk about this with regard to lifting recently too. I think it was Dave Draper's new book kind of touched on this. And I know a lot of your conversations kind of center around this type of thing. So I thought like this is something that seems really important. And also, we've had conversations around this separately. And then Jim, something that we talk about kind of in our internal meetings a lot of times is purpose, and specifically kind of post-coronavirus especially with powerlifters, and I guess any sort of athlete where sports are being canceled for a while. These things that at least we thought were driving a lot of our purpose are at least on hold. They're not proximal any longer. Some athletes are finding, hey, that actually wasn't my purpose for this at all. And then other athletes are really feeling lost around that. So, I think it's something that's an important topic, but man, it swirls in a lot of different directions. So I just kind of wanted to, maybe we'll start with that. Yeah. Out of words.
Yeah. This is a really cool topic because there's a number of ways you can look at it. There's like some of the stuff that originally got me interested in this I should take even a step further back. What originally got me interested in this was my awareness of myself going, oh shit, things have changed for you. You might not keep lifting with this current mindset. And some other part of me going, I don't want that. And it all stemmed from, there's this crystallized memory I have of sitting in the car with my wife back when we lived in Sacramento, probably 13 years ago, where I said out loud, if I couldn't convince myself that I could become Mr. Natural Olympia, I don't think I'd lift anymore. And another part of me went, what? Like, what the hell's wrong with you? Because I didn't start lifting to be Mr. Natural Olympia. I started lifting as a way of expressing emotion, dealing with angst, and giving me kind of this processing tool. And I just fell in love with it. I got bit by the iron bug, which I think we probably need to ask the question, like, what does that mean? And then once I took that and I directed it towards an external goal, something extrinsic, something was lost, at least temporarily, to the point where if that extrinsic focus for what I was doing had, at that moment, like let's say if before I actually did some work on that, let's say that year, I somehow had perfect knowledge that I would not become Mr. Natural Olympia, there is a chance I would not be sitting here today, And I realized that was problematic. And I've been thinking about that ever since, and that's embedded in the name of the company that I started with these four people, 3D Muscle Journey. And as I am kind of the overthinker of the group, the chief science officer, I started actually looking into some of the research on behavior and motivation. And there's this really fucked up study where they took, I think preschoolers or kindergartners, and I've talked about this before on many podcasts, I'll be brief, where essentially they looked at them and said, okay, who's currently drawing for fun? This is playtime. There's Legos, and this kid's kicking her, and there's this group of people that are drawing, and then, someone's peeing on the wall. And they decided, all right, we'll take the people drawing, and we're going to split them up into three observational groups. One, we're just going to see how many are drawing now and how many are drawing later. Another, we're going to enter them into a competition that they don't know they're in. And afterwards, we're going to reward them based on whether they drew the most, the least, or whatever. And then one group, we're going to say, hey, guess what? You're now in a drawing competition. And we're going to, whoever draws the most is going to get a reward. And they looked at how many of them kept drawing after that competition phase was over. And in the folks who knew the little kids who were entered and knew that they entered into this drawing competition, they had like twofold the amount of kids who just stopped drawing once the competition was over. So something that they were doing these are 4-year-olds. It's like as pure as it gets. What do you want to do in this free time? And it's kind of tragic, and I think we can probably all bring our own version of this into this conversation, or we've observed it or experienced it ourselves. And I think that parallels very much that experience I had in the car, where I realized, whoa, that's not good. Things have changed. And I think some people will make the argument, especially with the recent Michael Jordan and Bulls documentary, The Last Dance, that there is a pros and cons to this, right? Like the amount of drive that someone could put forth, or that competitive mindset, being a shark in the water, all the things that we kind of, especially in Western sport culture, we see as maybe not even a necessity, but a enhancement to your ability to focus and be effortful and succeed, of having that win at all costs kind of mentality. And it's worth it, quote unquote. And one of those win at all costs, one of those costs might be your enjoyment of the sport, your ability to get more out of it than that extrinsic goal, et cetera, and a loss of awareness of all the other potential things that can come from sport. So I think there's a lot of assumptions there. There's a lot of cultural things. There's a lot of framing and perspective. And it is a rich conversation to be had. And I think by nature, it's one that you have to keep having with yourselves, and that a coach could facilitate. And you have to think about, why do I do what I do? What do I want to get from it? What does this mean to me? What is at stake of losing? What is at stake of gaining? And also being open to the idea that, I can have a dynamic relationship with what I'm doing. Why I'm doing this today could be different tomorrow. And, we don't have to be the guy who announces my retirement from powerlifting on Facebook. Don't take it that seriously. You can always just lift weights again. You're not actually a first-round draft pick for the NFL. These are voluntary meets you're going to. So, it's this interesting thing that we kind of fall into these, things that we think we have to do, or these pressures we put on ourselves. So that was a bit of a ramble, but I'll stop there.
It's interesting to note, I think, that that sense of having lost the connection that you originally had would have been totally impossible if this extrinsic source of meaning hadn't come into play. That's the only thing that causes it. And of course, I think that's part of our challenge as athletes, as coaches, as competitors, is finding that balance, because it's kind of a natural progression. You get into something because you like it, and because you like it, you work hard at it and you get better at it and you want to compete. And once you start competing, man, it's like you're riding the sandworm. I'm rereading Dune right now, so hopefully at least one of you gets that reference. Cool. Once it's going, it's just going, and you kind of get in this, you get tunnel vision, where there's really, you don't even have the time to stop and step back and say, well, wait, why am I doing this again? No, you got to get to the next workout. You got to get to training. You got to get ready for the next competition. And it just, almost without you knowing it, at least, that's how my experience has been. It takes over every sort of, meaning, in my view, is not an objective thing. It's not totally subjective either. It transcends that. It's actually, to use a word Mike used earlier, it's nebulous. It operates in a lot of different ways. It does different things for different people. But sometimes when we latch on to one particular source of meaning, like competition, that source of meaning sort of fills in all the nooks and crannies. It becomes the only way we can derive purpose or meaning from that activity. And the challenge is going to be, how do we, for ourselves, for our athletes, for whoever, how do we find that balance between, it's totally normal, it's great to want to compete. It's because part of that meaning for a lot of people is pushing yourself to your limit and testing yourself under those conditions. And that's great. How do you strike that balance? That's enormously challenging, I think, especially the longer an athlete's career goes. And to some extent, the more competitive an athlete is, the higher their level of competition, the bigger that challenge is going to be. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. If you have somebody who's a really, really competitive athlete at the very highest levels of their sport, if things don't go their way, or if things start to, I've never been even remotely competitive at anything, and it's been tough for me to get worse at things. I can only imagine being somebody who's very, very, very high level competitive, to see that begin to taper off. And it is a cultural thing. It's certainly, there's extensive to an extent, or some parts of it that are Western culture in particular. But yeah, I think it's a conversation we should all be having as coaches and as athletes, because it's also a question of long-term health, psychological health, mental health, whatever you want to call it. Your ability to cope with that change in meaning, or suddenly dealing with what seems to be a lack of meaning, is really going to play a big part in your happiness for maybe for your whole life.
Yeah,
I think it's interesting what you said, Jacob, about being at the top and like that feeling of loss. Or I bet they're much more aware of the change from being pushed constantly, having the best athletes in the world, that they have to, like, if they don't put in the work in, which by the way is a lot more work than like the average person, to get marginal benefits. Whereas like for the layman, it's like they got to put in a decent amount of work, and they're going to get the difference in progress is going to be more significant than probably those at the echelon of the sport. And I work with a good handful of people in all ranges, at least within powerlifting. The people at the top seem to be really impacted by the loss of competitions. And it's difficult, because how do you, I have an idea, but I'm kind of curious if you guys have approached this time in a different way with those athletes, to like get them to start thinking about the other reasons and the other ways that they could find meaning within this, even if their primary driver is gone.
I've definitely thought about this a lot. Mike, you were going to say something. I'll go for it.
Yeah, I was just going to kind of weigh in maybe with an athlete's perspective, just having kind of done something like that, like gone from competing at a world level for a long time and then to, not competing at all. And I've talked about this a little bit before, but I want to start out by framing part of what I think, like where I'm coming from a purpose standpoint and a meaning standpoint, is this became very quickly, when I was, still an adolescent, something that I just loved doing, and that's just never really stopped. When I was a kid and didn't have access to a barbell, my brother and we got an aluminum baseball bat and would do manual resistance stuff just because we wanted to lift weights, and like thinking about it constantly. And a lot of people go through that stage and can relate to that. And I guess that was always kind of operating in the background. Now, later on, kind of at the peak of my competitive season, I was thinking along similar lines to what you guys are describing, that, my point, the purpose for me competing is to win, and things like that. And things that I feel like I have a more mature outlook on now. But something that came along with that, and I think I can credit my dad with this, just the perspective, is that just knowing that, hey, this is not something that is going to last forever, nor will you want it to last forever. There will come a time in your life where you're no longer motivated to get under the heaviest barbell that you possibly can, at some point. So when that day comes, you should at least have thought about it before, And so during the course of my competing, that would be something, a thought that would cross my mind now and then. And I would kind of mull it over, like, what am I, who am I if I hang this up? What do I care about here? And I wouldn't dwell on it a lot, but it became more and more of a reality. And eventually, when I decided to step back from competing, it was a much easier transition for me than it might have been if I had been resisting that the whole time. And I think it's also easier because socially, I'm I didn't have to deal with a lot of the social consequences that come from stepping back from a competitive sport and things like that as well. But, just kind of the intrinsic meaning, it occurred to me like, hey, yeah, I can express the meaning of this activity through a organized sport like powerlifting, but I can also express that in other ways too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in many ways, what you're describing is what I think is like the ideal place where if I could wave a magic wand, everyone would come to competitive sport from, and that they were doing it as out of an intrinsic motivation that they got inherent value from. They weren't lifting weights to do anything except lift weights, and that lifting weights didn't need a meaning because it had intrinsic value. It wasn't to get something else, whether that was internal or external, motivated by your own thoughts, health, performance, aesthetics, whatever, making me happier. I mean, all these things that we might look at as a more holistic reason to lift weights than competing are still not saying lifting has inherent value. Simply striving against something has inherent value, like climbing a mountain. Yes, you do feel a certain, achievement when you get to the summit. I suppose I don't climb mountains, but like whatever some kind of effortful striving is, it always gets initially proposed to us as to build muscle or to win this competition or to get to the top or to improve my race time. And I think it's a perfect scenario if kind of baked into your psyche at a young age or when you're first exposed to it, that I'm doing this because this itself has value. I don't need to have an extra sentence after that, whether it is perceived socially as good or bad, intrinsic, extrinsic, et cetera. It just has value. And I think the issue is that few lifters, I think not that many lifters come from that place. And then many of them who do come from that place tend to lose or forget that, or at least lose connection with it. Their relationship changes. So it's almost like trying to get back to it. And I find myself from a coach's perspective, a lot of the time I have to, not that I'm being deceitful, but the pathway to getting them to change their relationship has to be on a language they're currently speaking, So for example, if I have to explain to them, well, if you are not able to stay motivated to train, you're not going to eventually win, Right. So kind of the inversion of realizing that I'm not yet ready to have a different, or I'm not even about ready. My current reason for competing is something extrinsic, but I can't get any of those extrinsic things if I'm not doing the behavior in the first place, or if there's some threat to adherence. So it's like, I can't tell you how often with bodybuilders mostly, and powerlifters plenty of times, the pathway to a more holistic mindset comes by sneaking in my foot in the crack at the doorway of performance or winning or something like that. And realizing that's not, they had too reductionist of a mindset, it's got to be optimal. It's like, well, if there's nothing, it's not optimal, Right. So, yeah.
Man, a couple things there. I first want to offer kind of an alternative perspective on something you said there, Eric, about inherent value, which I get, which I take your meaning, but I think there's an important distinction we ought to make, which is, I don't know that the value is inherent in the way that we typically mean that. So what I mean is when a billy goat climbs a mountain, there is no meaning in that. I think that it's important that we recognize that we create meaning. And we do it individually for ourselves. We do it for each other in communities. I mean, think about how much of the meaning that we have from what we do is bound up in the various communities, powerlifting, bodybuilding, CrossFit, whatever, that we participate in. So meaning is very much something that we make for ourselves and for each other. And all that to say, of course, I take your point, which is that we want to learn to be able to do these challenging things because of what they do for us in return. And I think that's really important. And I I like the turn of phrase used there, sneaking your foot in the crack of performance, in the crack of the door of performance. I like that a lot. Just sort of getting people to, you got to start somewhere, but you have to open that door further. You have to give people more spaces for growth. Jim, to kind of answer your question, what kind of things have I been doing or with athletes at this time? It's kind of a weird perfect storm in CrossFit land, as you guys may or may not be aware. The competitive season is in a total tumult. Nobody knows what's happening, both because of COVID and because last year was our first year of a new competitive structure. And then now all this stuff with Greg Glassman being predictably terrible, I think is the way I would describe it. But yeah, I mean, I have a lot of athletes who are really, really unsure about what it is they're doing. What's fascinating is I don't work with that many high-level folks. I have one guy who's a 4-year games qualifier. I have one guy who is I think 2 or 3 year games qualifier in the Masters division, 60 plus, and the handsomest man in CrossFit. Shout out Clay Corwin. But a lot of my guys are just doing local competitions, or they want to perform as well as they can in the open, or they want to qualify for a sanctional. And even just the uncertainty that they're experiencing now is really throwing a wrench in the works. And what I've found is that one of the best ways to deal with it, and I think this is a lesson that I've learned from my own experience where, like I said, I've never been particularly competitive, but I always found myself, ever since I kind of stopped lifting as my primary physical outlet, maybe almost 6 years ago now, I basically started doing jiu-jitsu as the main thing. Every time I've tried to get back into the gym, it's doing exactly what you said, Eric, trying to get back to it, quote unquote. And it's only in the last maybe 8 or 10 months that I've realized that's sort of a tactical mistake. And I think the reason is that it fails to give you spaces to grow anew because you're so attached to something that used to be. And boy, what a truly useless approach to development. And what's happened for me is that I handed my training over to somebody else and almost started off too easy. Like the workouts were trivial. And what I found was that all of a sudden doing these trivially easy workouts, there's room to make progress here. I'm trying these new movements I've never done before. I've never trained with machines. Basically my entire life, I've never trained seriously with machines. And all of a sudden, here's this new thing I can improve at. I'm really bad at it, but I can move forward. And I started taking this approach, or maybe modifying my approach with my athletes, such that everything we did was just focused on, let's just grow a little bit in this space. Let's just set you up to make progress doing anything. Does it matter? Is it the most progress we could possibly be making? I don't know. I don't even know how to measure that. But we're moving forward. And it's, Mike uses the term build momentum, and that really is what it is. You have to create these spaces where athletes can see themselves progressing, where they can look forward to the next session. And ideally, you want to get to that place where they're looking forward to the next session, to take that next step, to do a little better without connecting it to anything else, just because it holds something of value for them. And that's obviously a hard thing to do with people who, especially, if you're a type A hard charger, you want to freaking win, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with being that way. But I do think that, as we're all well aware here, the big secret to getting to your best performance ever is to keep training for a decade plus. You're not going to do it otherwise. And it's nice to think we could, lay out the sets and reps and the, select the ideal periodization method and this and that. And well, that's just going to make you make the progress. And by dint of that, you'll stay motivated and you'll stay in the game. But we all know that's fantasy Christmas land. Human beings aren't like horse, that. Right. Yeah. Right. Exactly. So I think it's about that, finding ways to make progress wherever, even if they're small, even if they seem disconnected from the ultimate goal. Give yourself room to grow and fall in love with that.
One of the things that I've had trouble with in this whole experience is the I think there's somewhat of a false dichotomy that I see with a lot of just people talking about motivation in general that I don't think have thought that much about motivation and where it comes from, which is okay. But I don't think that there is a real dichotomy between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. I don't think that that tells the full picture, and I don't really think it matters where the hell it comes from. Why does motivation happen in the first place? It intrinsically or extrinsically there might be a group of things that are extrinsically motivated and a group that are intrinsically, but that doesn't really help. A lot of people love to be like, I'm intrinsically motivated, don't give a shit about anything. It's like, but you're experiencing a group thing, like you're doing a thing within a group. So why this? Why not biking? Why not whatever? And I guess I'm heated more than I thought I was going to be, but
why not lift alone in your garage like Mike Tuchscherer?
Yeah.
That crazy.
Well, there are other things that might impact it, and one of the things that I listened to a while back was Hugh John Gilmore's presentation at the EPC. I wasn't there, but people told me about it, and it got me excited about self-determination theory. And I kind of scoffed at it a little bit at first, and now it's like the only thing I can think about. And like like literally, it's like, well, the mastery is still there. Okay, we can still have the mastery. You can still really get good at lifting if that's the thing you like. You can, so competency, relatedness, and autonomy, right? So you can create some of that autonomy. You have the ability to get competent, but where's the relatedness right now? And I always catch myself thinking that for a lot of people, whether the relatedness is coming from competition or the relatedness is being able to talk in a group setting like this, just chatting about training. I mean, I was talking about this with one of my lifters. I was like, I have a podcast later today. I'm really excited. And then I started thinking like, I haven't had a podcast with a bunch of guys that I really enjoy and talking about all these high level training experiences for a while. And like, I missed that. And then my motivation, and I got excited about my training week in like an hour. I was like, oh crap, I can tell these guys about my training sessions, So that's kind of where my head's been at for a while.
Man, there's a couple of things you guys both hit on, which I really like. So first off, I think Jacob, really good point. I guess the way I should have framed it is that it's the difference between a process versus an outcome, rather than something of intrinsic value. Because you're right, meaning and value are things we create. And I think to kind of link that to what you were saying, Jim, it's like, why not biking, right? So like the little stupid ass games that are on Facebook where you you move a pin and then like you get treasure for this guy. I don't care about not putting treasure in lava for a made up prince. But if you start playing those games, you're going to look up 2 hours later and you're chasing achievement. So we have this built-in need. Many people the people on this call have this built-in need to improve. So I love what you were saying, Jacob, about how you just have that space for improvement. And I think that does absolutely hook into some of those concepts of SDT. And yeah, I think it is a false dichotomy. And it's not that intrinsic is good and extrinsic is bad. It's that I think a lot of the times it's easier to identify problems with an attitude than it is to identify what is better or good or what the possibilities are. It's easier to critique things. And that's not a knock. I'm not being the anti-critic, I'm mostly saying that we can tell when something doesn't quite sit right, when it's missing something. We don't always know what it's missing. So I get why people always fall back to what seems like cognitive laziness, but I think it's just a lack of knowing. Like if not A, then B. Well, not exactly. That's not exactly what we're seeing socially. It's like people understand that a win-at-all-cost mentality has problems. We know it will get you the win. We know a lot of these athletes do it. But then when we see something like COVID and people lose motivation, they can't do it, we go, why? They need more intrinsic motivation, And I think you're right. If we look at it at the perspective, well, okay, what is competition giving somebody? They get that ability to strive. They get to relate and be around a whole bunch of other people. They get social rewards. And they get autonomy. They're driving for a goal, but what are they missing? And I think that's actually a more difficult question to ask and to answer, because there's no reason per se necessarily that I can think of that you couldn't be incredibly motivated to become a world champion, but also love the process of training, but also to love the relatedness of just being part of this community, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I was actually really I'm not trying to claim that I did this by any means, but I was really proud of Bryce, for example, when he competed in the last nationals we had, Bryce Lewis. He had like 15 goals, that he wanted out of it. And I think that was very much intentional on his part. He's thought about a lot of this. Like, he does want to win. He also wants to, get PBs. He also wants to hit certain milestones. And he also really enjoys relating to people and being part of the community. And I think the problem is only when we have that kind of single-mindedness that we identify as a necessity. I think a lot of people are given the message either implicitly or explicitly that if you're not wholly focused on winning, it's a distraction. When probably more accurately, being process-focused can actually enhance the outcome. And we have data to show that. That's another cool study, which I'm going to really briefly go over as I've monologued plenty, and I've also done some other podcasts. There was a study where they did like 4 different activities. And again, many of them were not fitness related, like origami folding. Another one was yoga. But one of them was running on a treadmill. And they had people they had people guess, how long am I going to run? And then they just saw how long they ran. So they could stop whenever they wanted. And then one group focused on the process of what they got out of the process of running on a moment by moment basis. And the other was the reason why they were running. They were focused on, this makes me healthier or helps me lose weight or whatever. And that was their focus. And the people focused on the process ran longer than they expected, and also ran longer than the group that was focused on the outcome. And the group that was focused on the outcome didn't run as long as they expected. So I think there are some assumptions that we make about what it takes to be a champion that are in fact false. And when we really look deep at a champion, if you go past some of those crazy comments that we might hear someone make in the heat of the moment, or when they talk about their mindset, when the flip is switched and when they're right there, when Jordan's thinking about his winning game shot, is that really reflective of how they approached everything? Or did they have some sustainable relationship with what they were doing? They must have. Jordan played a long time. It wasn't just those things we cling on to because we basically still want to be watching gladiators. There's more to it. Well,
there's
Ronnie Coleman,
the story
still
of
lifting.
Yeah, exactly. There's the story of what happened, and then there's what actually happened, which may not be exactly the same thing.
Yes, what we glorify, and what actually led to the thing that which we glorify.
Yeah,
and I'll stop there for a while.
Well, I want to. I mean, there's like 10 different things I want to talk about, but I'll pick one. An idea that I floated to Jacob the other day, and I'll float here now too. And feel free to tell me if you think this is off the mark. But we were talking about training satisfaction, and if we kind of frame it that way for a second, I wouldn't say enjoyment. I wouldn't say, there are definitely times when training's not that enjoyable, but still on some level there's a satisfaction to it. Even if it's not what you would call fun, right? I'm wondering, the more I think about it, the more I think it might be that training satisfaction is the most important output of the training process. And now, before anybody listening to this thinks like, I've kind of gone off the deep end and results are important. Well, if you're the serious competitor type, then I would expect that your training satisfaction will be linked pretty tightly with your improvement in sport results. But there are plenty of people that we coach, that we interact with, that, they want to get better, but they don't want this to be a miserable process. Like, they don't, like you say, well, hey, the best way to get better at powerlifting is to just squat, bench, and deadlift until you die. Well, that sounds terrible to some people, and they want to get better at this, but not at that cost, So I wonder if addressing it, like if you could look into a crystal ball and understand perfectly training satisfaction, if you could kind of gear your training toward that, it seems to me like that, like if you did satisfying training, that's more likely training that you would stick to for a long enough period of time, and it would map to the things that you care about in the way that you care about them. Like if you're like, hey, I don't care if this is fun or not. Like, I just want to improve my sport results. Then your satisfaction should map to that, I would expect,
Yeah. I really like that approach. When you first brought that up to me, Mike, it actually got me thinking about, a few years back when you were writing my training. And this is what I kind of realized. There's one particular day that sticks out. It was at the end of, I think, the last training block we did together, and I PR'd all 3 lifts, and it was awesome. And that happened. That was one
testimonials.
Day. Yeah, look at that. Put that on the website. Don't ask what the lifts were. That won't sound good. But so my training schedule with you was 4 days a week. It was Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and on Monday I would have high volume, heavy squats and 2 hard bench exercises. And on Tuesday, I would do a deadlift exercise, a bench exercise, and a squat exercise, usually pause squats. I made the mistake before I started working with Mike of telling him that I had a high volume tolerance, which was true, but I paid for it. And those workouts were brutal. Like, to be honest, lifting, coming from a background of combat sports and CrossFit, lifting has never felt that psychologically hard to me. Like, I just don't, if you've run 800 meter repeats, like, lifting just doesn't hurt. It's hard to make lifting hurt that much. Those Tuesday workouts were brutal. And when I look back now, remembering that day I hit all those PRs is great. But the best feeling every week was Tuesday. I would finish that session. I was exhausted, and I would leave the gym with some friends and we would go get dinner. And it was that sense of like, man, I put in so much work today. I inched forward a little bit. Yeah, sure, I put a little bit of weight on the bar, but look at all this volume I did. Look at like, I feel so tired. I feel like I got the work done, and now we're going to go celebrate. And that's sort of the sense that I think we want to cultivate in our athletes, right? Because you're only going to get those days where you hit those PRs, they're once in a blue moon. The better you get, the more infrequent they are. So, what I'm saying is not load all your athletes up with infinite volume, but rather that I do think that you're onto something there, Mike, that if we can if we can make that a regular occurrence in someone's training where they finish their training day and they say, that was a job well done. I did good work today. I'm tired. I feel like I really got something out of that, even though I can't put a number on it. And to have a way of celebrating that, I think is really, really important. And it doesn't matter how competitive you are, because one day we're all going to be dead, and being dead is extremely non-competitive. But ideally we manage to keep training until then. And I think that notion of training satisfaction is a really good one.
Saw the wheels turning for Eric. Like, can I compete in being dead?
Yeah.
Am I the best dead guy?
I didn't come up with a solid answer. I'm gonna have to work on that one.
Yeah, man. There's something else here, and I mean, I know it's operating for me, and I get the sense that it is for you guys too. That we say, and I would agree on one hand that, there's not really, we're going to derive our own meaning from the training process. But at the same time, I know that my tendency is I want people to connect with this in a way that's long-term, that's, because that's the way I connect with it. Jacob, another story that I told you, I was telling you about a guy that I used to train with back when I lived in North Dakota. He had been powerlifting and competing since the 60s, and he was still competing. At that point, he's, he was lifting a lot for his age division, but, you're not competing in the open anymore at that point, and I remember going to the gym and watching him lift. He was just a regular guy, he would go in there and train. he's still squatting, he's still benching, still deadlifting, he's doing his own thing, and just a nice guy. But I remember watching him and feeling like I was watching something pretty profound. And it wasn't until I was telling you this story the other day, Jacob, that I realized that that's me, most likely, that's me projecting meaning onto that. So what is it about that to me is worth holding up in high esteem? And I think that it does. It makes me wonder, like, why am I evangelizing for this? And I think it goes back to the community aspects of it, the relatedness aspects of it. I want other people to see things this way. I want other people to just love lifting weights and want to stick with it long term, because I think that's cool, and it would be nice to have more people in this little community. So I guess that's me gonna lay on the couch and talk about my inner workings to some guys. So yeah, hey.
That totally makes sense to me, though. I mean, if you look up one day and you have this realization that everyone doing the same thing you're doing, externally viewed on Instagram, it looks the same. We both have a barbell on our back and we look like we're going to poop, but actually we're just standing up and down. Maybe someone did poop. We don't know. Instagram doesn't show everything. And there's no smello feature yet. However, the reason they're doing it is totally different than me. Like, if there wasn't this powerlifting competition, if I didn't get a medal, I wouldn't do it. Now, obviously, that's an extreme version. But now, all of a sudden, relatedness goes away. I'm not in the same group as these people. I'm not lifting for that reason, or only that reason. So I think, absolutely, it's easy to... I also don't think it's one thing, though, Mike. I think knowing you, you believe in goodwill towards people and better things happening in the world. Like, I think we recognize and we know that having something that gives you a sense of purpose, no matter what it is, that also challenges you and quite literally grows you physically and mentally, and that gives you a place to connect to others, is probably good. So if we can find a way to get people invested in it long term, not only does it make Mike T feels like he's more a part of this community and have more people to relate to, but is also in service of the community. And I think that's another big piece of finding meaning, is that, there's a lot of athletes who transition from competing to coaching and they get a similar thing out of it, or it expands their mentality of the sport. They're able to see it from that bigger perspective. They're not in the midst of it and sometimes wrapped up in competition. Now they can be like, how cool is this shit? I'm never going to get to go to Worlds, at least maybe not Masters Worlds in powerlifting, except for maybe that eventually, and compete myself, because I'm just not that good. But I've really cherished the opportunities I've had to go to Worlds as a coach, and it has helped me get a perspective of being not on the platform with all that pressure for that medal. And of course, I do want my athletes to win when they're at Worlds, but it's helped me foster that kind of perspective. And when I'm doing academic research, like the more ways that I can think of changing or positively influencing the community through lifting, that is not me lifting to get a medal today on the platform, the more opportunities to make meaning that I have found. And I think the shitty thing about this that's frustrating, especially for us programming-minded people, is you can figure out programming for your client, right? They can have a very, very similar experience, but have objectively better X's and O's, which might get them stronger, right? And we do figure that out for our clients. They don't necessarily need to understand the linearity of the program, okay? Sure, I'm not saying they shouldn't have buy-in and all that other stuff, that you shouldn't be a good student of the sport. Yes, but the point is there are some things that we are expected to actually figure out for our client, which are not really part of the art of coaching, but they're kind of on the what we do programming side of things. This is absolutely not one of those things. We don't get to figure out meaning for our clients. And even if you say the thing to them that they eventually figured out on their own, it means like 1/10 of what it means. Like you can't just give someone a book of, oh, you're an alcoholic. Here's the, I mean, that's a bad example because I'm actually thinking of a book they have. But like if someone like if you go to a therapist's office and they could go in the future, figure out the revelations you had, and they put it on a piece of paper, would not have the same effect, right? These are emotional changes that you make through figuring out who you are and the meaning you make and what that means. So like, that's why motivational interviewing is so powerful. And just for the listener and those who don't know, it's this kind of position where you're asking questions, but you're not asking questions to convince or lead them down a path. You're really just creating the space for this person to figure out what is going on inside of me. And I think that's where options come from. That's where different ways of looking at things are. That's where a conversation gets started and new perspectives can happen. Because I think when people enter into this powerlifting thing, and it's an established community with influencers and coaches and athletes and a qualification system and all these things, that becomes the default setting. If it's like we said before, the word of the day is nebulous. If it's nebulous and you give someone this easy way of going, oh, this is powerlifting. It's regionals to nationals to worlds to what's my total, what's my Wilks, what's my IPF points, whatever, then that will fill in that kind of nebulous picture. But in actuality, that nebulousness is something to explore. And I think a good coach through these kind of tools will help you explore that. And then you get to find out, man, I've got like almost an infinite number of opportunities and ways and flavors that I can make meaning of lifting. And ultimately, that's what we need to help our athletes do, I think.
It's one of the coolest things about coaching is that it seems to get increasingly complex. Like, you have this classic Dunning-Kruger effect when you start, but then even towards what feels like the edge, the other side, it's like, damn, this curve never stops. It's like there's motivational interviewing. There's, God, nailed the programming. I can help any athlete get stronger. Oh, well, what about like their psychology? Oh crap, I don't know shit about psychology.
Yeah, this is the downside of working with humans. They're complicated. Yeah. It's terrible.
God, it's so annoying. But it's on a more serious note, it's one of the things I love because I think I'm understanding that I've personally been gravitating towards understanding the way that we operate and why. And like, I never thought that was going to be one of the roles of a powerlifting coach. Because when we started, it was very much like, are you able to get the lifters to nationals or not? Because if you're not, then you're not going to make it out here. And when you
damn, Mike's a harsh taskmaster, huh?
Yeah, no, Mike never said that. That was my own perception. So that's for clarity. But then you get to this point, and it's like, well, I don't have. What if you work with a lifter that doesn't want that? Like, even in the peak of things, it's like first year or two, it's like I worked with lifters that literally did not care if they ever competed, but they loved lifting. And it's like, well, what do I do then? Like, how do I help you? And that, luckily, I've had a lot of experiences like that. And personally, not being super competitive, I can empathize with it. And Jacob, you mentioned before too, like you aren't super competitive, but you really enjoy that process of growing and learning. And I mean, one of the cool things with a lot of lifters that come to probably all of our companies is like we definitely have this perspective on training where it's like, but how cool are our front squat handles or something, like what are all these other things that are really enjoyable about lifting? And I think people are gravitating towards that when they come to work with us, which I might be speaking for everyone too much right now, but I really enjoy that personally to meet people that are in that perspective, because I can help them, but also the ones that are really competitive, the tool sets that I've acquired can help them. But right now it's a little bit, it feels useless right now. Like, I mean, it's not, but it feels that way if that's the only thing you think your value is right now.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, I think that, part of this is also about kind of finding meaning as coaches, because, it's totally plausible that you might be a coach working specifically with competitors for some period of time. And you might find yourself, I mean, this has happened to me, 5-6 years ago, basically every single person I coached was a competitive CrossFitter. And that's not the case anymore. I've got, maybe a third of my clients who compete in CrossFit at various levels. And then I've got a bunch of clients who do all kinds of things. I've got one guy who does weightlifting, who I've been working with for years and years. I've got a bunch of people who are general fitness clients. And I think it's really valuable to be able to find meaning in any of those kinds of things, or to make meaning of any of those kinds of things, of just helping people do their thing day to day, regardless, whether it's I just love lifting weights and I don't want to compete, or it's somebody who just, I feel better when I work out and I want to get better at exercise, for lack of a better way to put it. And Mike, you mentioned earlier when you were retelling that story, saying, you discovered that was you projecting meaning. But I got news for you, man. That's all any of us are doing. That's
sure.
all of what we're doing all the time is projecting meaning onto these things. And I think there's a lot of value to be found in thinking clearly about the meaning that we project. And because I think something that's worth noting is everyone is projecting meaning onto what they do, whether they know it or not. That can go bad. It can go bad if you don't think about it and sit back a little bit and say, what is the meaning I want to make out of this?
Well, that's an important point too. And just to kind of flesh out that idea a little bit more, thinking about what do you want to make out of it. There's also this observational component. So the reason that was a bit of an epiphany for me to realize that, that's me projecting meaning onto, that's what humans do. But I think that maybe better stated, the epiphany is that I gained some insight on what's meaningful to me by recognizing what's inspiring to me. I love watching Dave Tate's videos now, like his training videos, and he's doing like high box safety squat bar, like bloody nose max outs with 1,000 chains and bands, and like it doesn't relate to competitive iron sports except like in the vaguest observation, but like something about that is just effing cool. And I think that speaks to me as far as like, what do I think is useful here? What do I think is what's meaningful to me? And kind of observing like, oh, that's something that I think is inspiring. It's looking in the mirror a little bit. It's a reflection on, helps me better understand what I'm getting out of this.
Yeah. My jiu-jitsu coach is a really good example of this, where he's not old. He's a couple of years older than me, but he always has this outlook of like, I want to be doing jiu-jitsu when I'm 90. And as a result, the people who he respects and emulates and learns from are exactly the people who do that. And in turn, what I think is important, and I'm sure this is as true with my clients and with your guys' clients, that creates a culture of training. So my jiu-jitsu school is never going to be we're never going to be a champion factory, and everybody there is okay with it, right? We all get good. We all will train for a long time. Injuries are not that frequent. People don't get burnt out. And I think everybody there has a very good chance of still doing jiu-jitsu 30 years from now. And that's a conscious choice on his part. He consciously makes the decision to build that culture because that's what he wants. That's what has value and meaning for him. And he has built a community around that. And he's kind of imparted those values onto all of us. And there's people who that's not for, which is fine, right? We've had people come in and it wasn't their vibe. They wanted to be at each other's throats all the time. And that's fine. Like, I don't necessarily think that's the best way to produce competitors, but that's a different discussion. The point is, exactly to your point, you recognize something in this that was valuable to you. And now you have this opportunity, kind of like Eric was saying, to give you this new perspective, this new way of looking at it, to shed a light on that thing about yourself and to create a space where people who share those values or might come to share those values can grow.
I wanted to bring up Eric's point on motivational interviewing because I don't know if I validated it when I went on whatever rant I went on after. But it's something that is actually really difficult because I feel like when you implement it, you really just have to like, whatever I feel doesn't matter. Just like shut up and listen and ask questions. And then that's it. And I wish I could say like, oh yeah, that's easy. I that's all I care about. But it's really like, I like to have my own input. Like it's a habit or something that seems more difficult to let go of. But ultimately, it seems to be the only real way to get people to feel like they have that autonomy and they have that control. And talking about all these different, like, projecting meaning. I don't want to project meaning onto my lifters when I start going and asking them what their meaning is, because I mean, even the whole self-determination theory thing, I probably might be projecting that onto them and kind of pushing that idea their way, whether it helps them think about things or not. The whole idea of like interviewing someone to get them to feel like they came up with the answer themselves, it's really difficult. It's all it's all I have about it. It's difficult. If I could do it better, I'm sure it would be helpful.
Well, I think Jim, you like I came up to some degree looking at the whole evidence-based fitness culture community. Like that was our crew, right? And the implicit assumption of that whole crew, my people, the reason why I have these things up to make myself feel better in my life, right, is for people purely listening, I pointed at degrees, is that we have been taught that telling people information changes behavior, that knowing things changes behavior, that the problem is people know the wrong things. People have wrong ideas about carbohydrates. People have wrong ideas about bands and chains. People have wrong ideas, and we make memes about that. We get frustrated about it. We pound our fists. And this attitude is not, like, I'm not saying, and that's completely false. Of course, having good information helps, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all those things. But telling people information does not reliably result in behavior change. I know it's good to floss. I didn't floss today. And I'm not going to talk about how much I have not also flossed in prior days, but you can guess that today might be more the norm than the exception. So that's a huge thing in the fitness world. The whole obesity epidemic, we started with, well, if people just knew to move more and eat less, we wouldn't have that anymore. We still have it. Mm-hmm. So I think it's really difficult. Yes, now we also have shame and eating disorders. So something also you can have from the bodybuilding community. You're welcome. So I think when you're brought up in that culture and you learn all this information, and like you said before, the whole Dunning-Kruger effect of coaching, like there's more something to learn. It makes you feel as though once you sit down on that Skype with your client, and once there is a problem to be solved, it's your job to tell them how to fix it. And it's really, really scary to figure out the last 10 years of your own self-coaching education, if it was really focused on like empiricism and knowledge rather than communication or behavior change or interrelatedness and all that stuff, is that none of that matters right now. And that's not 100% true, but that's the scary part. And you feel like you do have answers. You have seen other clients fix this. But I think the way to view motivational interviewing is that, man, it's so much more powerful if they can come to whatever their solution is, and it's going to be some unique flavor for them. It might incorporate. I might be able to give them the tools to enforce whatever they come up with, but man, they've got to come up with it ultimately, and that's a scary place to sit in, and it goes counter to the conditioning we've had as coaches. If you came up in this very knowledge-oriented world. And kind of going back to how, like, we make memes of the things we don't like, and these are the problems and all that stuff. Mike, what you were talking about is basically, my jam. Like, you were looking at Dave Tate doing all this stuff that if you were kind of sitting in these evidence-based communities, like, wrong, bad. You're in the bro science camp. I'm in the other science camp. And that's kind of the nature of differences, which the differences are, we identify them. And we don't understand them, right? Because you are inherently doing something that I think is wrong, bad, evil, if we want to go politics or religion or whatever, or something in the fitness industry. Just like you're a bro, you're part of an out group. And since you're an out group, inherently that means I don't understand you. Because if you were doing what I understood, or vice versa, we would be in an in group. And that means that because we don't understand why other people are doing what they do, we have these superficial things which identify differences. But when you can identify what unites people, it's much deeper than that. When you can look at Dave Tate and you can say, this guy's going to be lifting until he literally can't move. I am too. We're in the same tribe. That is a very different and very powerful thing, which opens up a lot of new opportunities for people to connect. And that's the whole thing behind like Iron Culture. That's why that's my jam. Is if I can see the thing in you, which I relate to, now all of a sudden I can have more opportunities to understand how I can express this thing that we both love. So identifying similarities in people who you normally would see differences in, I think it also gives you more opportunities to figure out ways to express autonomy and competence, etc. And the last thing I'm going to say before I then shut up for a while again, the SDT, Jim, that you were talking about, when we create these models, we create these categories, they often present themselves distinct. That's the implicit assumption, like relatedness. And Jacob, you were talking about how we put meaning on everything. I think SDT fucks itself up all the time. In our effort to find relatedness, that changes our meaning of things, and we can lose autonomy. I want to be a power lifter. I've got to have a good enough total. I have to compete. I have to compete to win. I have to mirror your mindset in the social signaling you're giving me. I'm chasing relatedness to the point where I lose autonomy. And now I've lost my connection. I don't feel like I'm a part. I feel like I've lost my relatedness, and now I don't have autonomy. Like, where am I? I'm lost. So it's this really, really interested inversion, interdependent thing that is very complex. But at the same time, all that complexity, what are we trying to get to? A lot of the time, through that motivational interviewing process, we're just helping someone wade through all of these false meanings, or I would say maybe more like meaning assumptions or unnecessary meanings put on things in front of them, so they can wade through it all and try to get to the core, I would say maybe non-negotiables for them. What do I absolutely need to stick with this and to have purpose and to feel complete, if you will, from an SDT balanced perspective, to move forward and not stop moving forward until I'm no longer moving. So I think yeah, that's why motivational interviewing is so powerful, is because there's so much to remove before you can see clearly. And much of it masquerades as things that are important, needed, part of you, or part of the group that you so desperately want to be related to.
Yeah, I think one of the things that has changed the most about my coaching, right down to programming itself, over the years, is the extent to which I'm interested in asking my clients, what do you want to do? And then sometimes just straight up doing that thing. Just straight up saying, if they say, yeah, my squats feel best when I'm consistently working both between 6 and 8 reps and doing heavy singles and doubles. Okay, let's try it. And it's plausible that there are some adaptive factors there. It might be that they have sort of an intuitive sense of, yep, when I train at really high loads with low reps and also at higher reps and lower loads consistently within the same microcycle, they adapt more effectively. Yeah, that's plausible. But it seems to me altogether more likely, or that a bigger component of that is that they have this, what I think of as a training aesthetic. When they close their eyes, they envision their training being a certain thing. And they're the only people who have that. And the reason that I'm thinking of that here, Eric, is because, it sounds like a big chunk of what we're talking about is helping people discover the answers for themselves, helping them build that autonomy. And I don't know anything about motivational interviewing, so I don't mean to suggest that's what this is necessarily. But what I found is the reality is there's so many things about my athletes that I will never know, that I will never, ever, ever know, that I cannot know, that they might not even know articulately. They might not be able to explain it to you. Nonetheless, those are things about them, and they are things that matter to them, and they're the things that constitute who they are. And sometimes something as simple as asking them, how do you like your training week to be laid out, might lead you down a path through which you discover the most effective program for them. Why does it work? I don't know. Part of it's got to be intuition, right? Especially if somebody's training for a really long time, they get a good sense of like, well, if I squat heavy on Monday, I really do well if I have a lighter session on Thursday, and then I don't squat again until Monday. Or, some people might say, yeah, one really, really hard session a week and no more squatting. I think relatively few people, but you get the idea. And there might not always be an articulate reason why it is the case. It might not be explicable within the terms of physiology or sports science. But what it is nonetheless is it's something about a person, and centering the person in the training process, making everything we do about, I've been throwing around the phrase training an athlete is tending a garden, right? We don't build athletes. Right. The athlete already exists, and it's a question of allowing them to grow. And it very much is empowering, I think, to ask people, hey, what do you want to do? And not necessarily doing it, really, you can't even do it exactly because they can't articulate it exactly. And to formulate it into a program is a whole different thing. But to take seriously the notion that the people we work with have an idea of what they want, and to try to incorporate that into the design of their training, I think is a really empowering thing that helps them build that autonomy and helps them be engaged and helps them think clearly about training. And that's such a huge step in creating that kind of meaning that I think all of us, and for the record, whether it's lifting weights or competitive baristaing, which I recently found out is a thing. But it's all kind of the same thing, and I think
Seattle.
Hey man, I saw it on the internet. It's not just Seattle. It's on the YouTube, so you can see it for yourself. But definitely a lot in Seattle for sure. But yeah, I really do think that it's a big part of this is coming to that conclusion that training is about the person, and the program is something that, yes, there are mechanistic rules. Yes, there are things that we can know about the physiology of training that we can and should apply to our decision making. But ultimately, the question we ask is, what does the athlete want? How do we create that? And everything, I think, flows from there.
Yeah. It's something that I've been thinking about more and more. I don't know. It's an idea that I'm still trying to find the limits of. Just this idea that your engagement with the training, like being mentally present, interested, immersed in the training, is really effing important, and to go back to what you were saying about that may mean something as far as like a weekly structure or exercise selection or rotation of this or that or the other thing, something in the training. And it might make sense. It might not make sense. And it can change, but creating an environment where the athlete is focused, present, immersed. I'm really thinking that that's incredibly important in the training process. And when I talk about like the way that we write training, questions that I get about it a lot. So I had a question just the other day that's kind of exemplary of this. If I do a block, say we're squatting, and in block 1, I squat a single at an 8 RPE followed by 4 reps at a 9 RPE. And then in the next block, can I squat 4 reps at a 9 RPE as my benchmark and then do something else as the back off work, or is there an interference effect because there was 4s in block 1 and block 2? Well, if you know anything kind of about the doctrine that I teach, is that you want the blocks to be different. Well, is that different enough, or is it too much the same? Well, I think what that comes back to is, how do you perceive it? Is it interesting? Or at this point, have you beaten 4s to death and you kind of can't get excited for 4s anymore? because if you're at the point where you just can't get excited about this anymore, you're probably better off to choose something else. And to that end, like we talk about exposures in time to peak, and these are all rules of thumb at best. Like I'm not, I've said before, like I'm not proposing that there's some organ inside the muscle cells that counts number of exposures, or
maybe not your muscle cells.
Right. So what is it that we're observing here? Well, I mean, it's some heuristic, it's some observation about an experience, but there kind of becomes this question of like what counts. Like if I do competition pause bench in one day and then touch and go bench in another day, is that pretty much the same thing or not? Well, I mean, we have some heuristics that seem to kind of hold true, but the thing that I think is operating here is, does it seem like it's the same thing to you or not? Because I've come across some lifters that are like, look, man, touch and go bench, competition pause bench, it's the same thing. And it seems like it's the same thing when they train. And then I've had other lifters who are like, nope, it is dramatically different for me. It's not even close. And it seems like it's different when they train. And I think maybe it's the perception that matters, and whether that's being engaged with the training process or how you adapt to the training process. I mean, that engagement, I think, is really central.
I want to add to that, Mike, too. I literally just got off a call with one of my lifters, and she's awesome, and like just will do whatever training I write for her, and I'll look at her training block, and if she does well, then I'll probably not write another block that's pretty similar because it worked well before, And she asked me like, well, how do you make decisions about the programs that you write? And I was like, well, I usually wait for feedback, and if I don't have any and you don't give me any, and if I ask how it's going, you say it's all good and training's going well, I'm probably going to write a block that's as close to what we just did with enough difference for the next one where you get a similar response. And she's like, oh, okay. And then I was like, but the thing is that you don't give me a lot of feedback. Like I wasn't scolding or anything, but she's like, how can I do better? And I said, I think the next step is to bring attention to the exercises, because she's like, well, why do you program the exercises and the protocols? And I was like, well, similar response, it's did you do well or did you not? Or did you have a negative experience with any of them or not? But it's like there's another level for the athlete, and it goes back to what Mike said about like being mentally present for the sessions, because she wanted like to change things up like exercise wise, and I thought that's not going to solve any of the problems, or there's not a lot of problems, but that's not going to get to a better outcome. And I think the better outcome for her, and I told her, was, what if instead of just doing the thing that I wrote, what if we bring attention to how is this relating to the number one thing that you care about? Like if I write 2 count pause deadlifts, I told her, I want you to bring intention here to try to figure out how this is relating to the competition lift and whether or not you feel like that's valuable enough to do in the next block. And like, this is the first time, by the way, I've ever given that advice, which is weird because I think a lot of my lifters more automatically like think that way. And she's like, wow, that's, I will. Like, okay, yeah, well, I never really thought about that in that way. I just did what you wrote because she's very she's bought in. She's just going to do what I write. And I told her, like, I actually need more, I think, if we want to go to the next level. We've been working together for like a year, two years now. And like, for whatever reason, she's just, yeah, I'm okay. And she's had a lot of things that have happened, from an injury and surgeries and things like that. So like, we're finally back into this rhythm of like training's feeling good. There's no injury. She told me actually, as of like yesterday, it's the best her body's ever felt from that perspective. And I think now we're at that point of like, well, what's next? The next thing isn't for me to create another program that's like significantly different, because without input, what's going to change? And I think that what Mike said is bringing that awareness to your session to try to figure out what each thing that you're doing means to you in the way that matters the most.
Well, so I'm going to step in and be an asshole quantitative scientist for a second here. to go to your point, Mike, about you think what matters is the attention and the perception. I agree, but I also want to specify that I do think it's because of what those things, but not only of what those things represent, not just them in and of themselves. I think the person who the pause bench and the touch and go bench feel the same, they're going to probably have something different underlying in their physiology than the person who they feel different. And it's a different stance to say your perceptions in a well-trained, self-aware athlete who's been coached to be more self-aware and kind of be in your body and be attentive. Those are useful tools to understand what's going on in your body, rather than going kind of the maybe slightly more disconnected version of that, of going, hey, perception is reality, man. And I think that's important, because like to your point, Jim, about like there's so much you have learned from programming and all these things that those no longer necessarily occupy like our conscious holding of that while we think about programming. Like if we were to we're forgetting that we're making all these decisions about exercise selection, volume, intensity, all this stuff based on a lot of information that we've actually now have automatic in our programming experience. Like if we were to take a blank slate computer and look at it, it would be like beep, bop, bop, beep, because that's what machines say. And it would say, hey, there's a lot of like kind of quantitative exercise science here that then we're then making relatively subtle modifications to based on the buy-in of the person and their experiences and all that stuff that probably represents subtle but important physiological differences. And I'm not saying that this stuff doesn't matter, but I think that's an important way to look at it, because a coach who is earlier in their understanding of programming, who hears this, is be like, it's just all about what the person likes. And I think that's not quite it. And here's just one example. And this is not even necessarily for anyone who's on this call with me, but more for the listener who might be going and seeing a false dichotomy here. Like, I never think about the fact that I'm in a gravity well on Earth with, the 9.8 meters per second, yet I carry a certain amount of muscle mass required to exist on the planet and live as a human being. And if we were to all of a sudden snap our fingers and be on a more massive planet, we would all have slightly more muscle mass without any attention to it if we'd been brought up that way. So things are absolutely happening all the time without our attentiveness. But that's not to discount that attentiveness, expectation, and our psychology can't enhance it. There was a cool meta-analysis of quantifying the placebo effect in sports science and supplements and stuff like that. And a lot of the time it corresponds to what we would consider a significant but small effect purely from expectation. I'm talking like a 0.2 to 0.4 effect size. And that's similar to a lot of the exercise, dietary, and supplement interventions that are out there that work, that have a huge established body of literature. So it definitely matters, and it might be just as important as your periodization or the fact that you're taking creatine or not. But I think it's important to, in my opinion, that those perceptions in a well-trained, self-aware athlete, it's representative of something we should care about, that we don't have the quantitative ability. We don't have we can't look inside your body with perfect precision. This isn't actually devs for sports science,
Well, the critical part there too is, I think I personally have a tendency to forget how long I've been doing this myself and like all the things I've already tried. And it's a really good point. Like, yeah, Mike and like we've been thinking about this before. I think Mike has told me this specifically. Like, Jim, don't undermine the fact that you have experimented a lot already with so many people. So that's impacting the decision that you make with the person that says, this is what I want to do. And Jacob mentioned it too. Like, you don't just make decisions like out of nowhere. They're coming from somewhere. Where do they come from? Well, like most lifters, you said, don't actually have that understanding of like all these different things that impact them. But if they say, hey, I kind of like high intensity sessions and I want to train 3 times a week, I think, then you're like, all right, let's make some decisions here. Let's try the 3 times a week. Let's try the, higher or lower specificity thing. See how that goes. Because I think with the framework you're giving me, we can start there. And that's critical, because starting out in coaching, no way I'd be comfortable with what I just said like 5 minutes ago.
Yeah.
I want to introduce like two concepts from totally unrelated fields that I think are important here, that I think can clarify. Because Eric, I think you're right. It's important that people understand that I don't think what any of us are suggesting is just do whatever the athlete says they want to do. The two concepts. The first one is called personal knowledge. So there's a book by a scientist and philosopher of science named Michael Polanyi. And Polanyi basically made the argument that the way that scientists do their work is not purely objective. I think pretty much everybody knows this. Scientists are humans. But in particular, he thinks there's idea of, for people who are not watching, Eric just shrugged. He's not so sure.
I don't know if we're less than human or more than human.
¿Por qué no los dos? So basically, Polanyi makes the claim, look, at bottom, for any particular scientific theory that a scientist commits themselves to, that commitment is based on belief. And that belief is, in a sense, tacit. So the scientist has what Polanyi refers to as this sort of personal knowledge. It's a knowledge that they can't communicate to other people. It's not articulate. It's the result of their own personal experience with the science. And, not to say that you can't be right or wrong, but the reality is, at least in Polanyi's eyes, that at bottom, all knowledge is personal knowledge. All of us are making commitments of belief, and then we're shaping those into theories and tools and ideas and taking them out into the world and testing them. And hopefully we're making changes where it's appropriate to do so. But at bottom, even when we make a change, there's going to be a component of belief and commitment. And this idea of personal knowledge that's inarticulate, I think, is really, really important for coaches to understand for two reasons. One, you yourself as a coach are sometimes going to make decisions that you cannot articulate, you cannot fully explain. You're going to say, this seems like the right thing to do. And first of all, to anybody who has had that experience and has felt bad that like they couldn't explain it, you do not need to feel bad, because that is a normal part of how humans do knowing. That is part of knowledge. The other thing to understand about it is that athletes have personal knowledge. Athletes understand things about themselves, and no one else can understand them, and they can't articulate them. What those things are, maybe they are some kind of signifier of a particular physiological difference. Who knows? The point is that the athlete always possesses some self-knowledge that they're just not going to be able to communicate to you. So the other concept that I've been playing with a lot that I want to introduce here is called legibility. So I picked up the concept of legibility from an author named James C. Scott, who's a political scientist and really more of an anthropologist. And in the book, Seeing Like a State, and also in the book, The Art of Not Being Governed, he writes a lot about basically the way that states, like nation states, control areas. And in the book, The Art of Not Being Governed, he talks about this part of the world that is the largest non-state region in the world. And he talks about all these various features of non-statehood that make it non-state. But in Seeing Like a State, he talks a lot about this concept of legibility, that the state apparatus imposes from above these particular rules and strictures and ways of living that make it possible for them to essentially read the population. Think of things like unifying a language. Think of things like having a uniform system for last names, stuff like that. Why is this important to coaching? I think that in program design and training design, a big part of what we ought to be doing is we need a way to integrate knowledge about training with information that the athlete is giving us, information that actually comes out of the process of training. And what that is, the process of marrying those two things, I think, is creating a sort of legibility. You as a coach know things you cannot say. Your athlete knows things they cannot say. How do we design training, the program itself and the process surrounding it, logging training, having conversations with athletes, all of these things? How do we create that environment in such a way that we can walk away from our interactions with the athlete, where an interaction could be a Skype call or it could be reading their training log, where I can make sense of the information the athlete has given me and make good decisions. Note that I don't have any interest in explaining the decision. Sure, that's something that might be worth doing sometimes, but ultimately, we need a way to take that inarticulate information or inarticulate knowledge, something like somebody saying close grip bench is exactly the same as comp bench or completely different than comp bench, and making some kind of articulate meaning out of it so that we can make a decision. That's a very challenging thing to do. I think that, Mike is one of the leaders in this. Frankly, I think emerging strategies is very much this particular thing. It is crafting strategies and thinking about programming and training in a way that says the thing that matters the most is not our knowledge about training. That matters, but it matters in an instrumental way. It matters so that we can use these effective tools. But the tools are only as effective as your ability to read the information the athlete is giving you about their training.
Yeah, man.
That's so well said.
I want to loop in another concept here that touches on something that all three of you guys have said, and also maybe makes this a little bit more concrete. I'm aware that this conversation nebulous. It has a nebulous nature. It's kind of got a touchy-feely nature to it as well. And some people are a little more pragmatic. Some people are a little more mechanistic, I guess. So I want to show you guys something here real quick. So this is not gonna. I'll kind of describe what I'm trying to show for people.
Oh, you're such a nerd, dude.
Yeah, man. So this is Franz Bosch's multi-layer model of specificity. So I think this is a neat idea. I haven't really tried to break it down or find the limits of it or anything like that. But just I think when we think about what is specificity in training, our concept of it is just kind of rudimentary. Yes, that looks vaguely similar to the thing that I do in competition, therefore specific. That does not look vaguely similar to competition exercise, so not specific. But I think there can be layers to it. It can be a lot more than that. It can be specific in one sense, but not in another sense. And it can be a lot more complicated. And that's kind of what this is trying to show. So if you imagine a sphere within a sphere, like Russian nesting spheres. Okay, so on the outside,
we call those matrushka.
right. So on the outside, I won't go layer by layer because I don't purport to be an expert in this, but you have things like environment, the external factors, and then the closer into the center you go, the more inside the body you get. How to, intermuscular coordination, intramuscular coordination. But then I think the thing that's most interesting about this is at the center, there's intention. And this relates a lot back to what Jim was talking about. Yeah, you can do pause deadlifts, or you can do pause deadlifts with intention. And the intention that you bring to that probably matters a little bit. Now, it could be intention. We've been talking about this kind of on our team, as we've talked about, as it relates to weakness analysis. So, for example, you might have a person that's showing a weakness at the lockout in the deadlift, and you may think, okay, well, if we do block pulls, and then all of a sudden they're able to block pull way more than they're able to pull from the floor, but it's because they're adopting this advantageous position. They've just they're doing block pulls for the sake of block pulls. But if you do block pulls with the intention to improve your competition deadlift, well, now you make some different decisions along the way. Your intramuscular, your intramuscular decisions are a little bit different, on through the chain. And that's going to apply for other things as well. And I think it's even going to apply to, it's Monday, I'm here standing at the squat rack, and I'm paying attention to what it is that I'm supposed to do today versus I'm on autopilot.
I totally agree. I like that we've shifted this conversation now to, so first we talked about what the heck is meaning. How the heck do we find it? How do we help clients find it as coaches? And now we're talking about, and what does that look like when we start to bring that awareness into programming? because I think maybe someone could come away with this with it just being too nebulous, like you said, and they go, that all sounds cool. I'm mildly impressed, or I'm just annoyed that you guys overthink a lot. But what do I do with it? And I think this is a great example of saying it's not wholly separate and it's just not overthinking. It can also impact what you do. For another like, I'll give a concrete philosophical example, and then I'll give a concrete actual like microcycle example. So it is generally accepted as just kind of a self-evident logical truth that if you shore up a weakness that is the bottleneck of performance for an athlete, that will improve their overall function, right? The weak link in the chain analogy. Now, that often goes poorly in practice, because what you're doing is you're taking this athlete, and let's take it outside of the sport of powerlifting, just so you can see how there's a lot of demands on, let's say, a rugby player or an American football player. You can be big, you can be fast, you can be strong, you can be quick, whatever. If you take someone and they have a unique skill set that allows them to be successful despite a weakness, and now they don't get to focus on their strengths and they only focus on that weakness, it's an incredibly demoralizing factor. They're now eschewing the thing that they were rewarded for all the way through their career, the thing that was their X factor that now they don't get to play with anymore. And if we accept all the things we talked about in meaning, for this athlete to be at this point where they are at a high level, a lot of their meaning's tied up with that. So the art is in finding a way to let them still be able to express that X factor, do the thing that makes them feel like they have meaning, and through all those SDT kind of pathways that Jim talked about, while still shoring up that weakness. And that sounds like a challenge immediately. Now, here's this specific example. So I'm getting into Olympic weightlifting. I have a background of bodybuilding and powerlifting. If you were to look at my just raw squat and deadlift numbers, you would think my Olympic lifting total would probably need to be as much as 1.5 to close to basically almost twice what it is currently. So on paper, it's like this: we're going to give this guy almost no squats, almost no deadlifts, and we're just going to focus primarily on the third pole. But telling me, as this guy who's been rewarded and loves lifting and all this stuff, to just try to be quick, try to be mobile, get under this bar, use really light loads, that's a great way to make me cry, not a great way to make me a better Olympic lifter. So very savvily, is that a word? A very savvy decision by my coach is that we've been interacting. We have this cool RPE blended approach. I give him readiness scores, session RPEs, and we use RPE and RIR depending on the type of movement. I have a couple days where my main movement, and it's on a recovery day so that I'm ready for the hard stuff, like, snatch from hang and jerk from blocks and all this other stuff that makes me feel bad about myself, as I have these opportunities to feel great about myself. Do a power clean from blocks. Do a power snatch from blocks, do some bodybuilding work. And those give me this great opportunity to just be explosive on the part that I'm explosive with. And sure, you could look at it as I'm getting a maintenance dose of keeping me good at what I'm good at while really having more emphasis on the hard stuff. But it's also a nice, pick you up, dust off your butt and say, hey, you're still good. Don't worry. But we just need to work on this weakness, because it's really demotivating if you were to kind of divorce the athlete from their meaning and to try to get them to focus on that. You can grind through it and you can connect the intention with it. But if you're simply not getting that training satisfaction, like you talked about, out of the majority of your sessions, man, it's going to turn into a grind. And the person that might look up one day and go, why am I even doing this?
Yeah.
And then you're not going to get anywhere. I'm
really glad that you mentioned that, because watching you go through this process, that's something that I've been curious about, that it seems like it would be very difficult for me to do, to step away from these things that I'm good at, that I do derive meaning from, and I kind of see that same thing in you. So I was wondering about that. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, there's been a number of changes to how I find meaning. What is it to be challenged? I am proprioceptively, cognitively challenged. I am challenged by my ability to actually do the movement rather than how much load can I do in the movement. It has become more like I'm playing chess in some cases and trying to figure out what's that limiting factor. So it's actually hooked into the intellectual side of me in training, which wasn't as much emphasized in bodybuilding. I have had to get creative to maintain certain things. So for example, I don't want to lose my muscle mass. So here's just another interesting creative thing I've done. This isn't totally on topic, so I'll be quick. So how do I train my chest and my lats without that being a problem for the Olympic lifting positions? And I've taken it a step further and gone, well, how do I actually make it a benefit? So instead of doing like just a bunch of rows and pull downs, on my pull downs I'm actually trying to get into a hanging position, fully extending. And then when I do like pullovers, I'm doing them so that it pulls me into shoulder flexion before I do the pullover. And when I do, instead of like bench, I'm taking a pec fly machine and trying to get into the max range I can and producing force there. So I'm actually getting to, or like for triceps, I do them in a shoulder flex position. So I'm getting the opportunity to still do my bodybuilder thing, get the pump and get the look and really get that aspect that I love of training in a way that doesn't not only interfere, but also enhances my goal. And then I'm finding a new intellectual stimulation where there is not necessarily that I'm under a heavy ass weight. And it's all in service of knowing eventually, if I get good enough at Olympic weightlifting, I am going to get some of those experiences when I'm no longer a technically deficient lifter to the same degree that I am. So I've got a carrot in front of me too.
So I have another question here. This brings to mind kind of an experience that I had this would have been 2016. So I was competing, experiencing a lot of pain with training and trying to work around it, trying to work through it. And I was working with a physical therapist at the time, and we were doing, this rehab-y type things, right? And I remember at one point, we were making progress in terms of like being able to do the movements and experiencing less pain than I had before. So progress in that sense. And she kind of held that up like, hey, look, you're making progress. And my reaction was, I don't care about that progress. And I'm not trying to be funny or anything, but like that was really deep down what I felt at that moment. And now I'm like, I reflect on that from time to time. And I think like from a meaning standpoint, how much control over that do you think we have? I mean, I assume it's not total, but Eric, in your specific instance, it seems like you're grabbing hold of it and saying, this is what it is now, and I'm going to find some meaning in this. And we even have used the language in this conversation of creating meaning. Is it something that we can control? And maybe there are some limits. Question.
Yeah, so I think I'm good, and this probably goes back to the fact that my mom's a marriage and family therapist, and I'm an external processor and all this shit. I'm really good at articulating my self-awareness and being able to reflect on and describe what what gives me a sense of meaning. It's hard to know, and it's probably a much deeper question that we can get into in this conversation. It comes down to like consciousness and shit as to whether I'm in control of that. But I can tell you that my experience is that I'm an active participant in deciding what gives me meaning. But it's not that I'm changing my internal circuitry. It's that I'm aware enough of my internal circuitry and I have a goal that I can figure out what the pathway to connect the two is. And interestingly enough, bodybuilding, I think, is something that I credit that to a lot, because when to get from point A to point B in bodybuilding, and then to keep doing that multiple times, not just have that crazy shit I did when I was in college that one time, and I'm almost over my eating disorder now in my 30s. For not to be that, to be something that you've done multiple times, and I've done 13 shows now over 4 seasons, you have to have an extremely strong narrative meaning of why I'm doing this to get from here to there. Because there's going to be not just one point, but multiple points, months sometimes, and then after effects, months after it's all over, where you're past the meaning that you were trying to get to. You're past the narrative story arc when it fucking sucks, like bad, where it is really difficult, really challenging, and it still needs to somehow be worth it for you to get there. So I have this very kind of like adventure style hero story of what the Iron Game means to me that makes it worth it for me to go through all of that. And that I even find something positive in the recovery phase where I'm looking worse every day. I'm not getting on stage. It's years away before I can improve or change that, but it's all part of my Iron Game journey, my physical culture experience. And that's something that I think is very intentionally, it's been tested, and then it's given me that sense of autonomy. And now I can bake that into my next goal, which isn't even related to bodybuilding. It's me trying to be like, how do I be okay with the fact that I'm going to invest 15 to 20 hours a week of training and stretching and all the supplementary stuff I do for weightlifting to be a above average master's weightlifter? And that's the best case scenario, is above average, So I think, because if I couldn't do that, I wouldn't get there at all. I'd just be like, this is stupid. I'm just going to go back to powerlifting, or I'll just wait and get back on stage. I'm actually good at that,
Yeah, Eric, I think you touched on something important earlier, talking about challenges and just the fact that you're presented with these new challenges via weightlifting, but that you're able to relate them to this sort of broader narrative. I think something that is really important, one of the most valuable and overlooked things about training and sport in general, is that it's one of the few arenas in our existence where we're going to get to choose the challenge. You're going to be challenged just being alive. There's no escaping it, right? Some of us are, like me, are incredibly fortunate to have relatively few sort of real existential challenges, knock on wood. But you're going to be challenged in some way. And sport, I think humans pretty much all in all find or create meaning through challenges. But boy, it's real hard to find or create meaning through challenges that you yourself don't choose, that are levied on you, that are imposed on you. And I think that training, this pursuit of development, seeking some outcome, is one of the few areas where we get to say, well, what are the challenges I'm interested in? And I think that, kind of coming back to some of what we were talking about very early on with regards to meaning and with competition sort of becoming the proxy for meaning in training, I think part of the reason it's important to avoid that in order to cultivate a broader mindset is precisely that if we let competition or whatever thing about training take over all of the space there is for meaning, we're going to lose that sense of being in charge of the challenge, of getting to choose. It's going to be hard no matter what. It's going to be difficult. But if you get to that point where you feel like it's difficult and you don't have a say, you're just here to do it because it's the thing that you're supposed to, quote unquote, supposed to do, that's where all is lost. And I think that that's something we ought to emphasize to ourselves, just as a measure of being kind to ourselves as trainees, but to our athletes as coaches, is to always keep them in that space of remembering, hey, ultimately, I'm here to serve you, to help you get where you want to go. I'm here to help you fulfill these challenges that you choose. And if you want to choose a different challenge, okay, that's fine. If you don't cultivate that, because I've certainly been there. I think Mike, you were talking about rehabbing injuries and sort of caring about a certain type of progress and not another. You're going to run into those places where it's just you have proxied meaning, you sort of outsourced meaning to this other thing, and now it's just about that thing. And there's no space to create new meaning. There's no space to choose your own challenges. And now it's just another thing that is a result of, yep, I'm here, I'm alive, I'm on planet Earth, and shit's tough. And that's no fun for nobody.
Damn, what a send off. That was awesome. I'm motivated.
Go train right now, Jim. Go do some squats, bud.
Seriously though, like Eric, you said it a minute ago, like to start the conversation where we did and end up where it did. I didn't plan that, but then again, that's why I got the three of you guys on this call. So I was hopeful. So I'm going to declare that a success, and we can wrap things up here. So I appreciate you guys being generous with your time and your thoughts.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this was a blast.
True pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Reactive Training Systems podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider following us on the podcasting platform that you are currently using. Additionally, if you are a coach who wants to learn how to write better programs for your clients, then you might be interested in the RTS Classroom Emerging Strategies. The RTS Classroom is a 15-month course taught by Coach Mike Tuchscherer to provide you with a process to level up your coaching game. This quarter, we are launching Case Studies, which is a full course dedicated to teaching you the specific decisions that our coaches have made to help our clients get stronger and perform better on the platform. Enrollment for this quarter ends on Thursday, July 16th, and if you're interested, you can go to www.reactivetrainingsystems.com for more information. Thank you for listening, and we will speak with you on the next one.